This episode of GenreVision is brought to you by our premium subscribers at patreon.com/GenreVision. For $5 a month, our premium subscribers get access to an ever-growing library of exclusive bonus content, including weekly pre-show recordings, peeks behind the scenes, and a big currently consuming session every month. Sign up at patreon.com/GenreVision.
Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, we're going back to one of our favorite recurring segments, Global Gonzo, to talk about the Indonesian film Mystics in Bali. Before we do that, if you love what we do here on the show, please rate and review GenreVision on the Apple Podcast Store. It helps us rise in the rankings. That means more people have a chance to discover the show. It's a really easy, small thing to do. If you haven't done it yet, to the people who have, we thank you so much. You really don't know how much it helps the show. If you do leave a written review, we promise to feature it here on the show.
Make sure to tell us what you think of our laugh.
Well, speaking of distinct laughs, this week's episode on Mystics in Bali has a very distinctive laugh, which is baked into the actual lore of what we're dealing with. This is Global Gonzo. For anybody who doesn't know, Global Gonzo is our attempt to highlight and discover for ourselves films from a number of international markets that we think will be in some way kind of, I hesitate to say wacky, because I think that indicates a particular tone.
I think Gonzo really is the best word for it.
I think so.
They really do push the edges of what we consider to be, appropriate, and not just like content wise, but like tone wise, like to really push the edges of what we consider inside a particular genre. Because, horror genres in other countries, sometimes they don't look like the horror movies from the US. So it's nice to see that tonal variation. And that's something that Mystics in Bali, I think, does really, really well with is kind of showing a different idea of tone in horror.
Oh yeah, and part of our reason for doing it, and I don't even know if this was necessarily originally a reason, but it's ended up being one, is that by choosing films from different countries, we are actually exposing ourselves to different countries' folklore and myths and what they consider kind of baked into their horror. I mean, mostly, the Global Gonzo movies have been horror. And the first movie that we started off with, The Boxer's Omen, was just an assault of different cultural things that we were just not prepared for or privy to. And Mystics in Bali is kind of a similar thing. This is the first Indonesian film that we've done on the show. Mm-hmm. And it was very rewarding to watch this movie because it sent me on a research spiral, because this movie is centered around very particular folklore and legends about Indonesian culture.
Yes. Yeah. This is based on a book. It's based on a novel by a guy named Putra Made. And he wrote this novel that I'm going to mess up a whole bunch of pronunciations today because Indonesian pronunciations are not my forte, but Liak Gakak. Sorry. I massacred it. I'm sorry. But the Liak idea is like a Indonesian black magic. The actual Liak myth is slightly different, but this is also a movie about the Penanggal or Penanggalan, which is a vampire that would take its head off. And the head would fly around with its guts trailing from it, and it would look like a flaming meteor from a ways away, and it would feast on pregnant women or the fetus.
Yeah, I mean, it's said that it's possibly an explanation for the will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon in that culture, that it's a similar thing. So these elements are all in Mystics in Bali. And here's the thing. Normally with these movies, we especially with the Global Gonzo movies, which we assume a lot of our listeners have not seen, we break down the plot and kind of go through the movie's plot. Here's the thing, though. Mystics in Bali is 2 scenes repeated.
Pretty much, except for a couple at the beginning, but yeah.
It is primarily 2 scenes. The scene 1 is our lead character, Kathy, is an American who is traveling to Bali to write a book about like black magic and all this stuff. And she talks about how she has this is just her field of study, that she studied voodoo and all this kind of stuff. And she wants to learn about Liak magic. And she has an associate who also seems to be her lover, or her boyfriend. His name is Mahendra, although in the dub that we watched, he's mostly just called Hendra.
Yep. He's some Indonesian dreamboat with fabulous hair.
He's not a bad looking dude. Great mustache.
Oh, yeah.
He is going to show her where a Liak witch is, and Kathy is going to study with the witch and learn the different magic. So the movie pretty much vacillates between two types of scenes. One is Kathy and Mahendra are hanging out somewhere in a village or a hotel, I don't know, and they're just kind of vibing with each other. They get progressively more romantic each time we come back to this scene. And then the other scene is Kathy meets our Liak queen, the witch, and she teaches Kathy how to become a Liak witch. And that's for the majority of the movie, that is it. It's going back and forth between those two particular structured scenes. Now, that sounds really dismissive, or I'm being negative. It's not, because Mystics in Bali is really good at balancing its pacing between these two specific structures.
It is also very good at progression. Every time we come back to Kathy and the witch, there's some new element added. It builds upon what the prior scenes have done. So we come to expect like, well, this scene's going to go really fucking nuts, because like the last time we saw this, these two characters meet up, like shit got crazy, and it's only going to get crazier. And lo and behold, that's exactly what the movie does. So it's very, very simple in structure, and it manages to turn that to its advantage. The structure of the movie is kind of, surprisingly similar to a lot of what we might call, I guess European vampire fiction. I noticed some structural similarities to Dracula, but the mythology of this is distinctly Balinese. Bali is one of many provinces in Indonesia, which is a huge and very populous country. Bali is the only province in Indonesia which is primarily Hindu. The rest of Indonesia is primarily Muslim. And so you have this huge influence from Hindu culture in Bali, and that makes it a distinctly different place in Indonesia. So there's this wonderful specific flavor to the movie, and you get it immediately. Like this credit sequence opens up with this banging Indonesian music, and lots of shots of different traditionally made Liak masks. And it's just incredible stuff. Like it really sets a tone, and you get some wacky credits. It says the music is by something called The Disc.
Yeah, well, I was actually, as you're talking about the score, I was pulling up the credits, because the actual credit is to somebody, and I'm sorry if I mangle this name, is Gatot Sudardo, who is credited as Gatot S. The Disc, which is so awesome. Like, immediately I was like, that's really funny and cool and stuck in my brain. But then the score kept happening, and both Travis and I, through our screening, kept messaging each other like, this score rocks.
Yeah, it's a really cool synth score. That for 81 is surprisingly like forward looking. So this was originally released in 1981. The director of this is this guy that goes under the name H. Chut Jalil. Again, I'm probably massacring the pronunciation. I'm terribly sorry, but it's the director of Lady Terminator. So that's another sort of cult film that this guy has had under his belt.
Yeah, and I think the version that we watched, this movie doesn't look bad. Like, it's the filmmaking on display is not going to, knock your socks off with a ton of particular flair, but it's a very well constructed movie from a filmmaking standpoint.
Yes, and with a lot of specific choices in terms of the story that it puts forward. And I'm not sure how much of that comes from the novel, but also a lot of specific aesthetic choices that really make the movie what it is as a cult film. Like, it's just such particular choices in things like makeups and how certain effects sequences are achieved, and just, you know, what the tone of the film is like from scene to scene. Like it really is nicely unique. It is quite fun in terms of direction. And this is a movie made without sync sound. Like you have to know going in, like if movies made without sync sound bother you for some reason, this is a particularly egregious example, I guess. Sync sound is when you shoot a film, you have a sound recordist on set with a big boom mic that captures everything the actors say in hope that the sound on set captured is either good enough to use in the final film or good enough to use as a reference track when you're re-recording all your dialogue later. In movies like this, without sync sound, there is often no sound recordist on set because it is assumed that all of the dialogue will be replaced in post no matter what. And this was the standard for a long time throughout Europe and Asia.
Yeah, and it should be said the version that we watched was the English dub. I don't even know if there is a widely commercially available version of this in its native language. That would be the version I would prefer to watch whenever I can with a film. But the good thing is, the dub on this movie is going to give you what you want from this kind of experience.
Well, there are two dubs floating around, from what I understand, two English dubs. So I don't know which of the two we got, and I don't know what the differences between the two are.
Well, I do know that one of the differences is that Kathy in one of the dubs is considered Australian instead of American. Mm-hmm. But the dub that we watched, I believe, does come from the official DVD or Blu-ray release that is available through Vinegar Syndrome. And in this one, normally I'm very, like, unless it's like an Italian movie where it's like, well, look, this was the way it was going to be intended to watch, like you're saying, shot, not shot with sync sound. It was going to be dubbed and all the actors speak in their native language. So for this one, for example, the lead actress who plays Kathy, her name is Ilona Agathe Bastian. She apparently was a German tourist who got picked up and ended up playing the role. This is her only credit.
Yeah, she was just in Indonesia. One of the producers spotted her and was like, "You want to be in a movie?"
And that was that history was made.
That was it. And wow.
So it's very likely that she is just speaking German and doing her lines in German, and then her counterparts are speaking their native language, and so. Normally, I try not to watch movies like that if I can help it, if I can avoid it. It's like, no, if there's an intended native language to watch the movie, and I would watch it. However, in the case of Mystics in Bali, I am very glad we watched this dubbed version because whoever is doing the dub for the Liak Queen is one of my favorite performances that we've watched for the show this year.
It is so good and like very funny consciously. Like it's a really funny role. Like whoever wrote the lines for this had a great sense of what the character should be like as a comedic presence. It's so funny. And I just know that you and I are probably on the brink of teetering into doing the entire show in this voice because it's just so signature.
It is dangerous. We talked about this even before, like as we were watching the movie, we were like, we're going to get so much hate because we just want to do this voice constantly because it is this wonderful mix of like Frank Oz and like a classic cartoon witch.
Mm-hmm. You want to see my face?
Oh my! I mean, there's a line because the whole deal is that Kathy is going to come back each night and train with the Liak Queen. The first night she comes back, she's got to bring these milk jugs of blood to her. Well, I don't know, we don't see how she got the blood, or it's just like, oh, she just needs blood, and this giant, just elongated fake tongue comes out of the bushes, which we hear because the Liak Queen, when we first meet her, she says like, oh, I will always be someone different when you see me. And this time we don't even see her. She's just hiding in these bushes and a giant, just like, I don't know, what is it? Like
it's like a 10-foot tongue, but it's only a couple inches thick. So it's this big, long, ribbony tongue comes out from the bushes. And it's clearly just like hanging on a wire on a fishing pole. And the end of it is forked. And the end of it just snakes down into the bottles one by one to drink up all the blood. And the witch is like, this is good blood.
Yeah, she's like, good, delicious. This is good blood. It's so awesome. And the effects, I mean, are obviously, this is early 80s incredibly low budget and you know, an international film. So for what they're trying to achieve, I think it pretty much works, because the opening credits in which we see all these Liak masks kind of set me in the mood of like, oh, we're watching a play. This is another kind of cultural mishmash, but I immediately thought of like kabuki theater.
Well, there is a tradition in certain parts of
theater,
Indonesia
rather,
of something similar to that. I forget exactly what it's called, but you know, there is a scene early on where Kathy and Hendra go to this performance, you know, and it's a kind of like dance theater traditional thing, and there's this like big gamelan music group there, like pounding away on the gamelan music instruments, and you know, it's a really cool peek at Balinese culture. Well, actually, no, they didn't shoot this in Bali; they shot this in Java, which is the most populated province in Indonesia. That's where Jakarta is. So it's a specific Indonesian thing that's kind of, you know, adjacent to traditions like no theater.
Yeah. So the fact that the practical effects aren't there's I think there's a conscious decision not to strive for realism. Like and you know, realism is a term that we hate here at GenreVision for the most part, because that's not what every movie should be striving for. And this movie is not. Like, this movie is putting on a play of the Liak myth and folklore. And so when this giant tongue comes out, it's wonderful. Like it was immediately like, I'm going to like the effects in this movie.
Yeah, it's a silly fantasy image, and it's made extra sort of charming and funny by the fact that the movie is shot in scope. Like, it's a real wide aspect ratio. Mm-hmm. So the tongue has to stretch all the way across the frame.
It's great. And there are moments in this movie where the effects are so simplistic, but they pull it off. For example, apparently the Liak witches can turn into giant flaming balls, like we said, but in this one, it is literally just like a giant, I don't know what the material was, but it's just a giant ball on these strings that they're flying around over some lake. It looks awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I remember they did a similar thing in Kwaidan. If you've ever seen Kwaidan, there's the story where the monk goes to the graveyard and there are the sort of will-o'-the-wisp sorts of things. And it literally just looks like a tennis ball on a wire that they dunked in kerosene and lit on fire, and it's just swinging back and forth. That's what they do here, but it looks A, way bigger, and B, way more dangerous. So the danger of these like giant swinging like kerosene meteors in the air is just very funny. There is a shot where one hits the ground and this like big pool of flame spreads, and I bet everybody on set was like, "Oh fuck," you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's the charm of low budget effects.
Well, and the majority of this is like that. It is an effects showcase in a sense, like the. Every time we come back to another scene with Kathy learning more magic from the Liak witch, a new effect is being tried. For example, one of the things about the magic is that the Liaks can transform into whatever they want.
Yeah.
So the first time we see that, I think we're just told this. It's like, oh yeah, they can change to different things. It's like, oh, okay, like didn't file away that information the way I probably should have. Because then we get to a scene and it's the Liak witch and Kathy, and they're standing in a field and they just start convulsing. And then all of a sudden they have these weird prosthetics that are growing from their faces. Like they look like they're going Big Trouble in Little China style, where they're inflating and they're turning into pigs.
Yeah. Now, you're told often in fairy lore that a certain creature is a shapeshifter, and that can be accomplished in so many different ways. Early on, I thought, you know, when the Liak queen says, like, every time you see me, I'm going to look a little bit different. Well, I thought that's a pretty clever way of getting around, like, not having the same actress on set every day. Like, if this is really like a shoestring production and they're going like, well, who's available? You know, they might bring back a different actress on one day and, you know, try to put the similar makeup on her and make it work. But turns out, no, they really wanted to do some shape shifting stuff. Like, there's a legit transformation sequence where Kathy and the queen, turn into pigs. And, you know, the effects are definitely low budget, but still impressive. Like, there are some really creepy, gross close-ups on body parts shifting and morphing and changing. I would say it's of a similar production quality to the original Evil Dead.
Well, I was going to say that effects don't need to look the best. What's more important is that they have character.
Yes.
Like, I think that is more important for effects than being the absolute, you know, pinnacle of technical achievement at the time.
Right. They're there to inspire imagination and not be realistic. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, you know, when we talk about effects in movies, we're often talking about movies that were on the cutting edge, that were, you know, pushing the envelope in terms of what a particular effect could do at the time.
There are some oddly cutting edge effects in this for 1981, but we'll get there.
Sure. But that's usually the standard that we talk about when we talk about effects films. But I don't think that's necessarily the criteria we always need to judge them by. For example, Mystics in Bali, it's like, yeah, this came out a year after Empire Strikes Back, which is a way more, you know, technically impressive effects film. But Mystics in Bali, the effects, they achieve the goal that they're setting out for, which is, we want to disgust you. We want you to be weirded out. We want this to be spooky. They work in that regard. So when they start transforming into pigs, it's like, yeah, I can see that this is all, you know, made up of latexes and air bladders and things like that. But that's okay, because the effect through the filmmaking and the performance and everything, it's selling me on it.
Sure. Another thing that sells us on this is the sound design. You know, it's funny. This was part of an initiative by the Indonesian government to make a whole bunch of movies for international markets. And so you look at the marketing material from this, and there's really no marketing material from Indonesia. Some of the most famous marketing material from this is from Japan, and they market it as having fearphonic sound system. And the sound and the music really do a great job of amping up that spooky vibe. Like whenever they're outside, whenever there's an exterior night stuff, you know, with the Queen, there are always wolves howling in the background, and it just does such a great job of amping up that old school spooky flavor, that sort of classical horror sound design of, you know, thunder and and howling wolves, all this, you know, creaky castle sounds. Like, it really does a great job of evoking that and using it to its advantage. And then of course the score, like we said, just beats total ass. It's so cool. I'd love to have this on vinyl.
I agreed. I said to you while we were watching, I was like, this score needs to be sampled for stuff, because like the particular tracks and everything are so good. And it's just like, oh man, like, and immediately I think does the movie so many favors. So, but for the most part, the story of the movie are these two scenes. It's like, Kathy does some witch stuff. Next day, she talks about it with Mahendra. They kind of get a little bit closer, rinse and repeat, and that's okay, because it's like the things that she's doing is in the witch segments are always strange and entertaining and weird. And then when we get back to the stuff with Mahendra, the progression of their romance is nice. It's not like super complicated or anything, but it works.
Yeah, they're sweet together, and I like that. The movie handles that pretty well. The one monkey wrench that gets thrown into the gears is about the halfway point, where Mahendra starts to suspect that Kathy is falling under the witch's evil influence. And, you know, Kathy's just not the same. So Mahendra goes to visit his uncle, who looks like Indonesian Robert Shaw. It is uncanny. He looks like Quint. It is so funny.
Yeah, I took to calling this character Uncle Magic, because he is just ends up being like this font of information about, you know, the folklore and the magic and what you can do, you know, to potentially help save Kathy.
Yeah, he's like a local village elder and Hindu mystic.
Right. And what it turns out is that the Liak Queen is essentially possessing Kathy at night and turning her into this creature, which we said it's called the
Manangal, I believe it is.
I think it's the Penanggalan.
Yes, I think that two names for the same thing. But anyway, it's a vampire that its head detaches and flies away.
Yeah, well, its head detaches from its body, and underneath it is all of these trailing guts and organs and stuff. Mm-hmm. And it is such a shocking, I mean, maybe to you know, the native area, it's like, oh yeah, like it would be to us as Americans or something, where it's like, oh yeah, it's like a werewolf or a vampire, or,
right?
You know,
something
like
we
that.
know commonly from mythology. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Whereas this, it's so shocking when it happens, and the way that they pull this effect off is mostly twofold. One is sometimes they just have a dummy head with some fake guts that's on a string that they're pulling around, which is wonderful. But then there are the other effect shots in this movie. And most, until we get to the climax, most are used to pull off the effect of the Kathy's head leaving her body with all these guts attached. And it seems like whatever they were using to do the compositing, they shot these effects on video and then transferred it to film.
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what the process was, but it was definitely something really unique. They shot a lot of elements against blue screen for these scenes, and they have a distinctly different look from everything else in the movie. And I don't consider it to be a bad effect. I just consider it to be kind of like fascinating. Like, what was the process here? Because they clearly just had the actress who played Kathy like painted blue except for her head, and then they had a bunch of fake rubber guts hanging down from her neck, and then they had a fake body that her head sort of floats up off of. But it almost looks like some of the stuff in Tron where it was like early CGI effects where it's like, okay, this was a digital process that is like decidedly primitive by today's standards, but it has such a unique look and such a different feel. Like there's when they do the sort of animated magic effects later on in the movie, there's a lot of hand animated stuff, that looks like lightning bolts, and that's cool. But there's one shot where a character looks like they're meditating and they sort of levitate upwards. And that's like a Tron type digital effect. There's like rows of pixels that you can clearly see. I'm like, what were they doing here? This is kind of fascinating.
It is. And we'll talk about that later when we get to the shelf. But the thing is, I think a lot of people just look, it's like, oh, that's some crummy, bad old effect. To me and you, it was like, okay, fair, but it's distinctive. Again, the effect doesn't have to be the most technically proficient if it emanates a sense of character and a sense of style. And that absolutely happens in Mystics in Bali.
Yeah, and it has to effectively communicate an intention, I think, just in terms of visual storytelling, like the effect should be making something obvious, like, oh, this character was trying to accomplish such and such. Like later on, the witch is casting spells that come out of her arms, and they look like hand-shaped lightning bolts. Like, oh, okay, I understand what this character is doing. The movie doesn't have to explain it to me; it just has to show me the sort of hand-shaped lights coming out of her.
The majority of the movie again just keeps coming back. It's like we have another transformation scene in which Kathy and the Liak Queen turn into snakes. That one was really gross to me.
Yeah, this is really well executed, though.
That there's these close-ups on them where they have these just enormous. It looks. I was like, are they turning into like a frog or a fish or something? Where they have these gross, slimy, huge lips on their faces, and it's just like, oh, this is really great. But then we pull back and we see that they're, turning into these like the actual actors are in these like cocoon shapes that are actually, they're snake bodies.
They almost look like giant writhing maggots, and the shot lasts a surprisingly long time. It's like, ew, what am I looking at?
And what was great was we were talking about the movie that we kicked off Global Gonzo with, the Boxer's Omen, which track down the Boxer's Omen.
That has another riff on the same idea where it's like a monster that detaches its own head and the guts are trailing underneath.
Right.
That's in that movie too.
That is. But so we were talking about Boxer's Omen, and I was saying that it's like, yeah, this isn't as like relentlessly weird as Boxer's Omen, but the same kind of potency to its weirdness is there. And you were like, yeah, but it's not gross like the Boxer's Omen.
Yeah, I had to eat my words
immediately. I mean, it was proof that the universe has perfect comedic timing. Is you were like, yeah, it's not that gross. Well, we cut to the next morning after Kathy has spent the night, I guess, as a snake, and she barfs up a bunch of live mice.
Oh, I mean, obviously they didn't actually put live mice in this woman's mouth, but like you have a shot of her retching and then like a shot of the shower floor, and there's mice crawling around and a bunch of green goop, and then another mouse falls, and it's like, I mean, I was really viscerally disgusted. It was so gross.
It's awesome. So awesomely gross. And the fact that we were bringing up, it's like, yeah, the movie's not that gross like Boxer's Omen, and then that happened. I was like, no, never mind.
So, and then the movie proceeds to get like totally wackier when we get the first scene where Kathy's head like comes off and detaches and just flies away, because the way that they stitch these flying shots together is like, okay, you'll have the sort of oddly digitized video looking shot where Kathy's head will float off her body. And it's clear that they shot that against green screen. And then they had like a dummy head on a wire that's like on a fishing pole out of frame that they just whip through the frame. And it's so funny. And in a great way. I'm not laughing at how like low rent and silly it is. It is silly, but it's also wonderful. So this head flies off to do its dark duty.
Well, we don't know. I mean, finding out that this is part of the folklore, it's like, oh, I guess this is what happens. We were not prepared for what happened, in which the flying gut head flies into some woman in the village who's lying on a bed in her house, and they're talking. There's a bunch of people around. It's like, oh yeah, she's pregnant, and this, that, and
she's
the other.
In labor, I think.
Yeah, I think she's in labor, and this flying vampire guts head flies in and places itself in between her legs and sucks out the baby. And we see this by watching the woman's stomach deflate.
From a POV of the woman. So it's looking straight down at her abdomen, and you see her legs up, and then you see Kathy's face in between her legs, and the belly slowly deflates, and it's like, whoa, okay, this is wild.
Insane. Like it was one of those just like, there it is. Like, there's the moment. There's the one where it's like that did it, man. Like if you remember one thing from this movie, it's that kind of, crossing the line idea.
Yeah. And that's the midpoint turn of the movie. Like, it's a big moment.
So then it then becomes about Mahindra trying, it's like, okay, I see that, Kathy is being manipulated by the Liak witch and that she's using her for some nefarious purpose. I've got to try and prevent this. And I got to talk to Uncle Magic to help me out. And it's clearly building to a showdown between the Liak witch and Uncle Magic, because Uncle Magic goes into Kathy's room one night when her head is detached to go off and look for another victim. And the town at this point has realized, like, yep, there's a flying head. Like, somebody just goes, or like, it was a flying head. Very point blank in the dub, which is wonderful.
The dub really has some great lines.
It does. And they all decide, it's like, okay, we got to do something to stop this. So Uncle Magic realizes that it's Kathy because Mahindra's been talking to him. And when she flies off, her headless body is still in her room. And he puts these, I guess, some kind of like magically imbued picks into her neck.
They almost look like little toothpicks.
Yeah, I mean,
I was reminded of the shot where, spoiler alert, Mrs. Voorhees' head is cut off at the end of Friday the 13th, and you can see the toothpicks on the neck that were holding the head. It was a beautiful moment. But evidently, putting these toothpicks in the neck of Kathy's body prevents the vampire head from reattaching. And so there's this incredible moment of the head coming back into the room and like trying to reattach, and it can't. And so the head just leaves. And then the body, which was standing up in a corner, just clump falls over.
Just flop, cut away.
Oh, it's so funny. It's timed perfectly for comedy.
It's amazing. It's fantastic. So eventually it is going to come down to a showdown between Uncle Magic and the Liak witch. And this is when the movie goes pretty much full Dragon Ball Z at this point.
Oh yeah. And they're like shooting lightning bolts out of, their hands at each other. And, that moment earlier where I talked about the character levitating, and then there's that weird digital effect as he moves around, Uncle Magic does that shit. And what gets wild is that this escalates to the point where Uncle Magic dies. The Liak witch slits his throat with her long fingernail, and it's a pretty gnarly gag. And he dies, and he's gone for like a minute while the fight goes on. But then who comes back? His brother, which is this, I think it's the same actor, but he's dressed in white garb instead. I'm like, oh shit, it's Gandalf the White. Come back.
Yeah, I thought it was Uncle Magic like resurrected as like some, holy person or something. But
back as a ghost or something like that.
Yeah. But it turns out it's his brother, and he's going to match his magic against the Liak queens. All this while, like, Kathy and is kind of fighting with Mahindra because she's still under the spell of the Liak queen. There's some great shots. I mean, again, this all sounds funny and wacky, and it is. But at the same time, I want to emphasize this movie is doing good filmmaking stuff. During this fight, between Mahindra and Kathy, there's a very quick cut in close up of Kathy's face as she bares her fangs and goes, you know, and we get a close up of her eyes and they just, you know, animate a little bit of glowing yellow into her eyes. And it's maybe, you know, just a couple frames, but it was like, ooh, wow, that was really effective. Like that was a cool shot. And that's a lot of Mystics in Bali. Like Mystics in Bali is wacky, but that's not its only laudable trait. Like this movie's made well.
It is. I mean, I think we're selling it a little too much for our listeners here. This is difficult to recommend because this is like so far up Drew and I's alley, but it's very outside of the norm. I hesitate to recommend it to people because I don't think a lot of people are going to get the enjoyment out of it that you and I got, even though I'll fucking go to bat for this movie. This is a good movie. I don't think it's directed with like extreme stylistic flair. Its style is very, very simple, but it never forgets what makes it effective. It's a very functional style, but it never loses sight of like, okay, how do I make this work as a horror moment? Or how do I make this work as a comedy moment? It understands its tone. It's not unintentionally funny. It's pretty damn funny. And you sense that you sense in the intentionality, like it wants to be funny. There are some cuts that have to be done intentionally. I mean, it would seem unlikely that this movie just sort of haphazardly stumbled into what it is. That didn't happen.
No, I will not only go to bat for this movie, I'll recommend it because I think people will enjoy just the baseline ridiculousness, especially if they're not familiar like we weren't with the elements of folklore that come in so many surprising ways in the movie. But I think it's the simplicity of its structure is actually a benefit to this kind of movie. Like comparatively, The Boxer's Omen. The Boxer's Omen is an onslaught of just what the fuck. It never stops.
Yes, and it pushes the boundaries of taste more frequently.
Sure, and it doesn't contain like it doesn't stop doing that. It's not like, well, there's like one scene that really pushed. No, it just keeps going over and over. Like it assaults you with its brazenness.
Yeah, and it's always upping the ante as well.
Yes, but Mystics in Bali, by having a much more simpler, digestible structure to the majority of its story, I think actually helps temper that weirdness in a way that might make it more palatable to more audiences. It's still excessively weird, but it's not assaulting you with weirdness all the time.
No, and I think the structure is close enough to European vampire folklore that American audiences will understand what it is they're seeing structurally. Like it's not so out there. Like Boxer's Omen is so steeped in just like the weirdness and mysticism of South Asia, or Southeast Asia rather, that I think it can seem a little bit impenetrable because it's pulling out so many strange and specific ideas that will be foreign to American audiences. I think Mystics in Bali will come off as less foreign, you know, and this is intentional because the Indonesian filmmakers wanted to make this film for foreign markets. They were not trying to make movies for Indonesian audiences here.
On that I think that plays into, again, the structure of the story and the cast. It's like our lead character is not a native person.
She's a tourist. They were trying to drive up tourism in Bali.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's a really important facet to this movie working so well, is that, like you're saying, they made it with the intention of it being a movie that they could sell internationally. So they made their lead somebody that was going to be more internationally recognizable. So I really loved this movie. Like it of course, like you said, it clicked so specifically into our rhythm that I get it if a lot of other people don't, or they just see it kind of ironically or only value it for its ridiculous, its seeming ridiculousness. But as far as like a global gonzo entry, I would almost like The Boxer's Omen is such a high bar that at this point, I don't even think we'll ever reach again.
It's hard to match the like sheer just outright craziness of that movie, but this movie gives it a run for its money.
Well, I was going to say that the Mystics in Bali, I would actually rate this as of the global gonzos that we've done, this is the one that I'm like, I want to recommend the strongest because I think that you will get a sense of what we're trying to accomplish with this whole Global Gonzo, recurring segment. And I can't say that it's palatable enough, but I think it is approachable enough thanks to the way that it was made that you will get all of the wackiness that you expect, but it will not feel like you're being beaten down by it or that the wackiness is the only thing that's worthwhile talking about this movie. And like you said, maybe people won't be able to recognize what we think is some of the good filmmaking and storytelling and structure and everything. But I think it's there. I think it's absolutely there to be seen.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about Italian horror movies earlier this year with things like Demons. And I remember listener Eric Fuchs talking about how he wasn't a big fan of Italian horror because it was frequently nonsensical. And he's absolutely right. And it's something that Drew and I actually love about Italian horror, but I can understand how these films being nonsensical can turn people off. This film is not nonsensical at all. As a matter of fact, it establishes its mythology and says, you know what? We're dealing with these kinds of, creatures. Here's what they do. Here's how we deal with them. And it executes that premise to the end and says, okay, well, this is that mythology and this is the set of rules we're dealing with. And, this is what the outcome is going to be. Like it's a vampire story. People will get it.
Now I will drop some criticisms on this movie. When you talk about being it not being nonsensical, there are nonsensical moments. For example, in the final climax, a female character appears who apparently was a former lover of Mahendra's.
Mm-hmm. And she's never forgotten about him. She still loves him.
Which both Travis and I are like, who is this? Has this person been in the movie?
She has been in the movies. From time to time, she will peek out from like bushes, and the movie will cut to her like staring at
that
Mahendra
was her
and Kathy kissing. Yeah, that's her.
She's the other. So she was the other Liak witch that she was fighting with sometimes.
No.
Okay. Well, so there's that. There's also, and I think this is just a matter of what the movie was trying to go for. There's times when they will cut away from particular scenes, like Kathy barfing up mice, and it's just like, all right, moving on. And it's like, what? No, like that's what? Like you can't just walk away from that, but it does. And it's like, well, okay, like we're moving on. That now is like a more endearing and charming aspect of the movie. But if you're looking for like a very, digestible logistic pattern to this, the movie does divert from that frequently enough that I could see that being frustrating for some people. But otherwise, I mean, I loved Mystics in Bali. I'm really glad, we're going on break next week, and I'm glad that this is the movie that we're going to be, sitting with for a week off, because it's like, oh yeah, like this, we really liked this.
Yeah, I'm really pleased. But, I also have expectations that not a whole lot of other people will dig this the way that we dug it. But I mean, this gets the GenreVision seal of approval. This is like, again, like one of the better Global Gonzo movies that we've covered. And it's just a lot of fun. That's really what it boils down to. I had a ton of fun watching this movie. I thought I was potentially going to be bored by it because I was like sleepy, but then you and I started watching it together and it was so like reinvigorating. It was a really, really fun experience. And I recommend you seek it out. Thanks to Vinegar Syndrome, there is a physical release of this, but you can also find this on the web. There are some places that list it as being in the public domain.
I mean, I'm assuming that's particular prints or cuts or something. So it is available out there, but if you really want to get what I would assume is the best commercial release of it, I recommend the Vinegar Syndrome release.
Yes, agreed.
But now we're going to head over to the shelf where we pick a movie that might act as a good pairing or replacement for our main topic. And as always, we encourage you, loyal listener, to go to GenreVision.com, comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf pick, and we will feature it on next week's episode. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Mystics in Bali?
I feel like this movie is finally getting its due because a lot of people used to poop on it, but it turns out this movie's great. And it's Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Even, back when we did that movie on the podcast, you were still like, I don't know. I think that movie's pretty bad. And I felt like I was the only one out here really advocating for that film because it's great. It's full of just such incredible effects and, really is a pretty rich exploration of vampire lore, in addition to being a fairly good adaptation of Bram Stoker's original story. As an effects film, I think it's an utter masterpiece. And it goes to some really wacky places and puts Gary Oldman in insane makeups just for one scene because it was cool. That's it. Just doing stuff because it's cool.
Nothing wrong with that.
Not at all, especially when the movie's as good as Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Does it have some wonky acting in it? You bet your ass it does. But you know what? It's still pretty great. All right. What are you pulling off the shelf, sir?
Well, I wanted to pick another international movie, and one I don't think we'll ever do on Global Gonzo because it's one we're very deeply familiar with, and one that's much more easily available and kind of has its own deserved cult right now. This is House, or as I like to call it, Hausu, from 1977, the Japanese film. This is available through the Criterion Collection. This is another movie when we were talking about when we were watching Mystics in Bali, in the sense that it's like, yeah, the effects are not the most technically incredible and impressive, but they have a particular character and style. That is so much of what's going on in House.
Yes, and all of the weird choices they make with effects, and all the things that could potentially be, quote, holding it back as effects artifacts. It's like, no, this just lends a more specific flavor and character to this movie. House came out in 1977 and uses a lot of optical effects, and the way at which it uses it like flies in the face of what Western cinema was doing at the time, with things like, ILM making Star Wars, which was, of course, revolutionary and incredible work. But Japan using so many of those similar optical techniques to be like, fuck it, anarchy. It's just incredible. I love House. It's great.
I adore that movie. And one of the other reasons I want to bring it up is that in the same way that Mystics in Bali is a consciously Indonesian movie dealing with Indonesian folklore and myth, House is a distinctly Japanese movie.
Very
like
much so.
There's no American version that you can do of House, like because the specifics of it are so tied into its culture's idea about witches and ghosts and vampires and stuff like that. And I love that. I love that Global Gonzo has kind of become a teaching tool for us to learn more about these different cultures' approaches to this kind of horror folklore. So if you want like a real big, House is an assault like Boxer's Omen. But
it's not nearly as like boundary pushing though. It's like way sillier.
No. It is far more palatable. But wonderful. It's such a wonderful cartoon. I've seen it, I think the Criterion thing is like, how do you describe this movie? It's like Scooby-Doo meets Mario Bava.
Sure. And it's really funny. Really very funny.
It's extremely funny. So yeah, I absolutely love House and highly recommend it if you've not seen it. But we do have to jump over to the listener shelf picks, and we actually have to mention a shelf pick that got submitted after we had recorded for 2 weeks ago when we did Possessor. This is from JT, and their shelf picks were History of Violence, connecting to David Cronenberg, and The Naked Gun, because Possessor stole the assassination method from The Naked Gun, which I love that. So wanted to get that taken care of. So thank you so much, JT. JT also had shelf picks for last week's episode on The Mask versus the Cable Guy. One of their shelf picks was Funny People, which is a comedy that takes comedian plays his general persona for slightly darker but still funny means. JT had another shelf pick, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Eric Fuchs went with Ingrid Goes West for The Cable Guy, which Ingrid Goes West is a really good movie that I highly recommend. Tough movie, though. Dark movie. And for The Mask, Faust, Love of the Damned, which is a movie directed by Brian Yuzna, who Eric Fuchs describes as From Beyond meets Spawn. I have seen Faust, Love of the Damned, and I can see a future where I watch that movie again. And also, Eric Fuchs had The Housemaid, which is a 1960 Korean movie about a devious maid who worms her way into a middle-class family's life and right into the husband's bed. This is not The Handmaiden, I'm assuming, which
nope.
That's the, okay. I did not see that, so just sounded very similar-ish.
You should see The Handmaiden if you haven't seen it.
Wall Drumpus had two shelf picks. They had Hentai Kamen, which is about another repressed guy who lets loose when he puts on a mask. He says it's a very good parody of manga and anime tropes and a lot more fun than its juvenile-sounding premise lets on. And for the cable guy, Walt Rumpus went with The Big Lebowski because it also has a cable guy in it who does a shitty job. That's good. I like that. And finally, Mr. Milksteak's shelf picks were for... and finally, Mr. Milksteak's shelf picks were for The Mask was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I don't even know if we mentioned that during the episode, but it was one that we mentioned during our screening. And for the cable guy, Tropic Thunder, which is another Ben Stiller kind of subtly dark movie. But great.
Yeah.
Great picks. Thank you so much, everybody. Love seeing the shelf picks every week. And I look forward to the ones for next week. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Okay, so there's one thing I want to talk about here, and that is The New Mutants, which is the long-delayed X-Men film, which is finally out on VOD now. You can buy it to own it. You can rent it. I rented it from Apple TV for like $5.99. You talked about it last week, and your take on it was surprisingly positive, which I found, very encouraging because I take you at your word and I trust your opinions on stuff.
Maybe not after this.
Well, I watched this movie after renting it. I paid, I served my nickel. Come and take me. This movie is quite bad. And I would love to be its champion. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I would love for this movie to be like, totally unfairly treated, but yeah, it's just a bad movie, man. Tell you what, let's do some spoilers on this movie. This movie is small, but the smallness is not the issue. Just a handful of characters in a secluded location, really low budget, and presents them with really limited number of scenarios they can have in this very small situation. But I found the script to be so weak, and the directorial execution of that script, in terms of filmmaking, to be weak as well. And it's like, well, okay, if those two things are weak, you already have like a recipe for disaster. But then I thought, well, with so few cast members, they're really going to have some like strong performances to support this thing. And they don't have the strong performances to support this thing. It really is quite a limp effort from Josh Boone as a film. I mean, just in terms of filmmaking, it's like, is this guy, like, what happened here that this movie came out so sort of bland and flavorless? And it purported to be sort of a horror movie, and it, supposedly is presented to us now in its unfucked with format. Like they had planned on making a whole bunch of reshoots, which I understand because the movie that Josh Boone delivered was not good. But evidently those reshoots didn't happen because Disney never found the right moment and the right circumstances to like dump a whole bunch of money into this movie. And so they kind of decided, fuck it, we'll just release it as is, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of money to market it. Very disappointing.
I'm sorry. If you want to hear my thoughts, you can go listen to last week's Currently Consuming. I stand by my take on the movie. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, I think I'll be very interested to see if this movie ever goes through a period of reappraisal at all, because at this point, you even said it before you saw it. It's such a pitiful movie. Yeah. Its existence is pitiful.
Piteous. Yep.
And I think that it's just being thrust out there with no fanfare regarding its actual original release, or its home release. It is most likely going to hide away for a long time.
It is, and it'll never be regarded as anything important to, what people like about contemporary comic book cinema, which is all about like canon and extended universes. Like, this just belongs nowhere, which it's going to make people going to write it off.
Part of the reason I liked it was that for the majority of the movie, the characters don't like each other, which is another thing about modern super. It's all about like, well, yeah, they may, quip at each other and bicker, but it's all, hearty and good and warm and nice.
Yeah.
There's a character in this that is openly, flagrantly, genuinely, shockingly racist.
Yes, there's actually quite a bit of shocking content in this movie for a PG-13. You know, I do feel that it is pushing some boundaries, and I appreciate that idea on paper. But like Anya Taylor-Joy, who plays Ilyana Rasputin,
Magic.
aka Magic, she is openly racist and says so many racist comments to the lead, Danny Moonstar, who is an indigenous person. I forget exactly which tribe she belongs to in the movie, but the movie opens on her reservation as it's being destroyed by the demon bear. But Ilyana Rasputin never hesitates to make some sort of like distasteful comment, like always calling her like Pocahontas and shit. I'm like, ugh, this is like really ugly and unpleasant. And what's unfortunate is like Anya Taylor-Joy's performance as this racist character is the strongest performance in the film. And it also wants us to sell it like on a redemption arc for her, that she's the hero that's going to like take on the demon bear and help Danny fight her demons. And it just rings of bullshit constantly. And then it takes a lot of Hughesian influence as well. There's a lot of like boundary pushing stuff in terms of high school. Like these high school age kids are all a little grown up. They're all a little too oversexed in some ways. Like there are a couple of mildly eroticized girls shower scenes with like, you know, side boob and all this stuff. I'm like, what's going on here? There's a scene where a character confesses to masturbating twice and doesn't use any euphemism. She says, I masturbated twice. And she's in a confession booth. And I'm like, wow, this movie is in some ways surprisingly frank about its intentions. And I found that kind of shocking because so much of superhero cinema these days is like totally sexless.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I stick by my read. So if you want to hear my thoughts, you can go back and listen to last week's episode, currently consuming. Check out the timestamps that are in every episode on GenreVision.com.
Anyway, that's all I got. So what's been on your plate, dude?
Real quick, just before we started recording, I watched the first episode of the Animaniacs reboot that's on Hulu. I was not at all interested in this, to be honest. I knew it was coming, and I'd seen trailers, and I was like, okay, cool. I'm glad they're doing Animaniacs, and it looks like it's in the spirit of the original show, which I was never like a diehard. So like I watched the Animaniacs and that whole era of Warner Bros. I was more into Tiny Toons, which predated it. But you know, I liked those shows. And GenreVision's sister and friend of the show, Danny Ryan. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Danny.
Mentioned that the first two episodes were really good. And I was like, well, I've got a little bit of time to kill before we start to record. And, you know, it's 20 minutes. I'll check out the first episode. And I was pleasantly surprised. I very much enjoyed the first episode. It still got that same, you know, just no holds barred takedown attitude that the show had back in the day as far as its commentary and silliness. And it's also still a very overtly Warner Brothers type cartoon, which some of the laughs that I had were not, you know, any of the meta humor or the you know, adult, if you want to call it that, references. It was just like, yeah, here's like a really funny bit of cartoon violence for a second. It's like, hey, they crafted that joke really well. Like they understand their heritage in that regard. But it's very clear. It's like, yeah, this is the Animaniacs for 2020. There's the opening segment is about them coming back. It's like, oh, you know, it's been 22 years. Like, what have we missed? And there's a great joke, which Yakko is talking to the CEO of Warner, and she has a tablet. And she's like, this tablet, you know, this is a tablet that contains the sum of all human knowledge. And Yakko's like, the sum of all human knowledge in one easy to swallow tablet? Like, so he grabs the tablet and eats it. And then he actually gains all of the knowledge that they've lost for the, you know, last 22 years. And he sings a big song about it. And I mean, and I'm sure there will be people that are like, oh man, I hate that there's all these, you know, politics and cartoons and stuff. It's like Bill Clinton was featured in the opening song to the original Animaniacs show.
Yep. Yeah. The Animaniacs didn't hesitate back then. Why should they now? And
they don't. I mean, they really don't, which is
great.
Kind of amazing. There's some things that I don't know, you know, and this is true. It's one of the reasons why I'm not like crazy about the original Animaniacs. It's like, well, it's of its time. Like, so there's a lot of references and things that were, you know, funny then, but just haven't withstood the test of time. And I think that will be the same with this version of Animaniacs, but they're they ain't pulling any punches. Like I was there's a shot where they're singing about all the different kind of current event, like presidents essentially, that took place while they were gone. And one of the lines is like, George W. searched for WMDs. And it's a shot of George W. Bush in bed and he's looking under his covers with a flashlight. And I was like, this is really funny.
It's Animaniacs for grown-ups is what you're saying. There's a lot of stuff that'll go over kids' heads.
Well, the thing is, Animaniacs was always for grown-ups in a lot of ways.
It had a lot of stuff that went over kids' heads. Like when I watch old Animaniacs clips now, I'm like, wow, they were really on some next level shit.
Well, I mean, there's so many of those things, and I'll be interested to see what kind of, because right now it is just like the Warner Brothers and the Warner sister and Pinky and the Brain. Like those are the only segments, but it's like actually there were like a lot of different types of characters and set. Like even as a kid before I had any know, like there was the I think they were called the Good Pigeons, which were these group of pigeons that were like stereotypes of kind of Scorsese gangster type.
Sure.
And there was a whole song where they were like singing about a statue of Scorsese and whether or not they were going to shit on it. Like, and it's that kind of stuff. Like this was made with the intention to be like sold to kids, but it's really for adults without being, you know, I mean, there's so many jokes in this where it's like, in the Pinky and the Brain episode, the first one, Brain is figuring out what the internet is. Like he creates the internet essentially and creates memes. And he's like, that's how I'm going to take over. And he's like, do you know what most people use the internet for, Pinky? And Pinky's like, I do, but I don't think I can say it. Like, and it's like, this is, you know, the cleverness is there. And, the new team totally understands like the vibe that this should have without being, I mean, and there are jokes in here that I'm like, wow, like bravo, like good job. So you know, it's not like must see TV or anything right now, but you know, I'm enjoying it. I'm very surprised as somebody who's like, I'm not interested in it at all. After Danny's recommendation, I checked it out. I was like, yeah, you're right. This was funny. I laughed. So yeah, if you need a laugh, which I think we could all use in 2020, why not check out the Animaniacs show if you have Hulu? But let's wrap things up with our
comment of the week.
And we are coming back to loyal listener JT with their other shelf pick, which is Once Bitten, which was an anti-shelf pick from JT. He says, the somewhat forgotten high-concept, lowbrow sex comedy starring Jim Carrey in his pre-In Living Color days. It pretty much reels in his more noteworthy elasticity as he plays a run-of-the-mill high schooler who runs afoul of a vampire seductress. Dubious sexual politics, including one of the worst gay panic scenes in all of 80s cinema.
Wow.
Talk about the territory that has to claim. That's high. It does have a ubiquitous choreographed dance scene, which actually lets Carrey unleash some of his signature physical comedy style. So, yeah, I mean, I've always known about this movie. I know this movie more for its poster than the actual movie. And I always just knew it's like, oh, yeah, it's like that really early Jim Carrey movie that nobody goes to bat for. But I mean, like, I don't know, if it weren't for the fact that we did Willie Million Jr. this year, like this would be one. It's like, well, maybe we fall on this sword because it might be interesting. Like we'll have a bad time, but it'll be interesting. But I think it's going to be a while before we do one of those movies again.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, it's 2020. We got to give ourselves some comfort food here.
Yeah, and we will be doing that next week. We are taking a break next week for the Thanksgiving break, but we will be back the following week, and we have, I think, I'm so looking forward to December. You can go check out our schedule at GenreVision.com. Just click on the header that says schedule. But 2 weeks from now, we will be back, and we're coming back with another Global Gonzo because we love Global Gonzo. And there's been a couple months where we skipped it this year. We wanted to come back with a good one. And it's a movie that I've actually seen before, and I've wanted to get Travis to watch. And it's December. It's going to be the holidays. What more perfect time to see Dial Code Santa Claus, also known as Deadly Games, also known as Game Over. This movie has a number of titles. Right now, if you do want to see it, it is available to stream on Shudder. It's under the title Deadly Games there. I'm so stoked. I actually just picked up the Vinegar Syndrome 4K Blu-ray for this.
Nice.
Because I think you'll see why when we watch the movie. So I'm very stoked to watch Dial Code Santa Claus. But our whole schedule for December is going to be, I think, really fun. We're going to do a crossover episode with our other show, FinFlix. We're doing what we always intended to be the FinFlix Christmas special, which is Jaws the Revenge, because Jaws the Revenge is a Christmas movie, as you will find out. And then we will also be doing a movie that neither of us have seen. This was Travis's gimme, so I knew nothing about this beforehand, but we stumbled upon Santa Claus the Movie, starring Dudley Moore and John Lithgow. And we watched the trailer, and Travis was immediately like, we have to do this.
It looks pretty wacky, yeah.
So we're doing it. There's some notable stuffs about it, like it's the last movie made by the Salkins, who did Superman and a number of other movies. And then to close out the year, it turns out we're going to be doing Wonder Woman 1984 because they decided to release that on HBO Max on Christmas Day, which is a decision we support, considering, you know, everything that's going on right now with movie, with movie distribution. We decided that since they did that, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we will end the year with Wonder Woman 1984. So that's going to be our schedule. We will be back in 2 weeks. I would recommend taking this break time to go back and check out some of the episodes from this year or other library episodes in the GenreVision library, because we've had, I think, a really good year. It's going to be fun kind of looking back at the year when we get down to it. And and then come back in 2 weeks for Dial Code Santa Claus, which is a movie I'm eagerly anticipating revisiting. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your listenership so much. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we will see you next week.
Well, not next week, but in a couple weeks. Right here on GenreVision.